The Checkpoint is presented by GM Pharma, the first international multinational pharmaceutical company in Georgia. GM Pharma, to serve those who need it most.
I'd like to start our conversation with the recent assessments of Fitch and Moody's for Georgia. Fitch said that this war in Ukraine played as a positive shock for Georgia's economy, and Moody's said that this war turned out to be a booster for Georgia's economy. It wasn't that visible when the war was starting. We remember how the government of Georgia projected that Georgia might lose $2 billion because of this war. What is the logic behind the developments for Georgia's economy?
Well, I wouldn't want to use the word positive because Russia's aggression in Ukraine has been so devastating and so cruel, and it has sent shocks throughout the entire world economy, including supply chains and availability of certain key items in food. It's also led to worldwide inflation that we've felt here in Georgia as well. But it has also led to a large influx of people and capital. There are 100,000 Russians here now, more than that, in fact. There's over 15,000 Russians have opened businesses. In addition, a lot of companies, because of its proximity to Russia and ease of doing business here, have moved, including a lot of U.S. companies, have opened offices here. Since the start of the war, U.S. companies, tech companies like Lineate and Jetty Cloud and EPAM have started to hire more and more Georgian engineers and expand or establish footprints here. We are hearing more and more from investors all the time who are interested in this area. Cerberus, a U.S. company that does hydropower, has been here for a long time and is continuing to work. Plus, other companies interested in renewables are coming here. So it's really created a lot of opportunities, but this shouldn't be mistaken for sustainable growth. This is a short injection, and that's why if you look at the projections by the international financial institutions, while Georgia's had double-digit growth, it's actually gone down to single-digit growth, which is still growth, but that they're projecting for next year. But I think that there is some debate among economists about how long-lasting this is. And really what it comes down to is that this is an opportunity for Georgia. And it's really important what Georgia does with this opportunity. All of these companies coming here, all of these companies focusing on it, depending on their experiences and what they hear from the other companies that are here, that will really show whether this is sort of long-term growth or short-term growth.
You mentioned a couple of
Yes.
things that I would like to dig deeper, but talking about the general context, we hear from the government still that Georgia is not going to set any sanctions, any independent sanctions, as they call, against Russia. But the question has never been whether Georgia should set sanctions, independent sanctions for Russia or not. The question is whether Georgia is integrated into the international sanctions. And we see some questions raising from very influential media outlets, including CNN, Amanpour, whether or not Georgia is part of the sanctions. What is your take and personal view on that?
Well, as you say, it was never a question about whether Georgia would have their own sanctions. I think that as a close partner and friend, the U.S. understands the situation that Georgia is in economically, although we have worked with Georgia for many years to make Georgia less dependent on the Russian economy. And so I think the issue is not whether Georgia has sanctions or not, but whether Georgia is becoming more dependent on Russia or less dependent on Russia. And the important trajectory is less dependent on Russia. In terms of international sanctions, we have no evidence of violations of sanctions in goods and trade, that there are things being smuggled across the border. However, when you talk about export controls, international sanctions, you have to understand that it happens all over the world. I can't say that there's no smuggling into the United States, obviously. And so it's what systems and what capacity do you have to deal with it, and are you taking it seriously? Are you taking the issue seriously? So we have a very long history of working with Georgian customs and Georgian revenue to help build their capacity for issues just like this, although the numbers are so high that it is honestly impossible to know everything that's going back and forth across the border, you know, and what's sort of packed with other things. Because I'd also like to underscore that food and humanitarian items are not sanctioned, that we don't sanction those. So just because there's trade going across the border doesn't mean that there's sanctioned trade. But what Georgia has to do is Georgia has to take it seriously, and we're working with the Customs and the Revenue Service to help them do just that.
From this standpoint, would you say that the pandemic was a bigger hit on Georgia's economy than the war that we're currently facing?
Yeah, as it worked out, because Georgia's economy was and still is very heavily dependent on tourism. And so the ending of tourism was a tremendous hit on the economy. And one of the things that we're also trying to do, as much as we do support, and there are a lot of USAID and US government programs that continue to support tourism development, we also want to support Georgia's development to diversify its economy. You know, we do vocational programming so that people can get skills that they need that match the skills of what's needed to help lower unemployment. We work with the Georgian people to develop tech skills, like I mentioned, the companies coming from, the US companies coming into Georgia, and we try to help work that because we want a diversified economy. I should also say that as much as US companies here, we're also seeing more and more Georgian companies and Georgian innovation going to the United States. Georgian ferroalloys exports to the US, Rustavi steel exports to the US, Aeon Rise assembles solar panels that are exported to the US, and an advanced medical device invented here in Georgia by Aptos is now being exported to the United States. So we're talking about high value exports, we're talking about working on our overall goal of further integrating Georgia into the European, US, Western, and world.
Is Georgia-US FTA still on the table in discussions? This is always
yes,
a question.
I know it's always a question that I get.
So
free trade agreements are done by the US Trade Representative, and they look at technical issues and do constant assessments. And the USTR is always engaged in what's happening in Georgia and learning about what's going on in Georgia, but I don't have any further news at this point.
And also one more information that we had, there might be direct flights between Georgia and the US. Can you update us on that as well, or is it also in the queue?
That's something that we've talked about for a long time, and we are actively talking with the Ministry of Economy about the steps that's required for that. The biggest thing that we need is an airline that wants to do the direct flights. There are other things that need to be done, checks with the airport and other technical issues, but that is something that I think we would all love to see.
Exactly. Also, let us talk a little bit later about the challenges that these changes on the geopolitical landscape has brought to Georgia. But first, let's talk about some of the opportunities. Do you think Georgia is ready to utilize the opportunities that are coming now with the actualization of Middle Corridor and the shift towards like more demand for Middle Corridor?
Yeah. Well, as you know, we've been working on developing the Middle Corridor and the potential of the Middle Corridor for a very long time. But yes, this war has really highlighted the opportunity, an unprecedented opportunity, that Georgia needs to take advantage of. There's a lot of plans. There's been a lot of discussions. It's time to move from plans to actions. We'd like to see Anaclea moving forward, but it's not just Anaclea. It is the entire line that we have to really look at, and we want to work with Georgia to look at what needs to be upgraded so that the entire Middle Corridor can be more efficient and more effective. We're also investing in the Middle Corridor in other areas. The U.S. International Development Finance Corporation invested $50 million in loans to a new Poti port terminal that doubled its capacity, and that helps take advantage of the middle corridor. We also have been working with Tramo in Batumi, investing with them to help them build their capacity. So this is something that we have been working on for a long time, but I think the time is now to act quickly.
If we look at the inflows of FDI, and also if we look not only at the Anaklia project, which I remember Ms. Degnan once called a missed opportunity for Georgia, unfortunately, but we also see some large hydropower plants, for example, Neskra, Khudoni, all the Namakhwani. Also, we see this very unfortunate trend of international arbitration courts and cases against Georgia's government. So what could be done in order to make this investment climate more appealing for FDI? Because FDI is not only money, right? It is also know-how, it's technologies, it's skills. It's much more than just money.
Absolutely, and you're correct on that. And I think that we want to see projects moving forward, the hydro dam projects that you mentioned as well, and let's see actual movement on that. We see a lot of plans, a lot of discussions about what to be done, but it's really, this is the window of opportunity that Georgia should go. And yeah, when investors look at the country and the questions to us and the questions to other businesses that work here is, what is it actually like working here? What are the experiences that people are having? So the very high ratings in the indexes get people's attention, but then they ask the people who are here. So it's ensuring that the companies that are working here have a good experience in the area. And of course, as we mentioned in our commercial report, also making sure that you have a judiciary that will make fair decisions for businesses, because no business wants to come and invest here and then end up being taken to court and then not having a fair shot at court or taking too long in court. So this is another area that we try to work with the Georgian people on, and the Georgian judiciary, which we also have a very close partnership with, helping them build the capacity to make sure that cases can be adjudicated quickly and fairly. And I think there needs to be more progress on that. Since
we're talking about the opportunity, let us in this part, and that's Black Sea cable project that's come to the surface. We know that the World Bank is helping Georgia to have this feasibility study and to see whether this is a bankable project. What's your take on that? And do you think Georgia should be more actively involved in leveraging this project?
I mean, when we talk about the Black Sea cable, when we talk about Anaklia, when we talk about the Middle Corridor development, what we're really talking about is we want to integrate Georgia more tightly into the world economy, and particularly into the European and US economies, and weave Georgia into that, because that's what brings the security and the prosperity for Georgia. And so the Black Sea cable is another opportunity. We want to see the feasibility study on it to see how much of an opportunity and what can be done there. But we also want to make sure that all of these projects are in a way that Georgia is not just a transit point, but Georgia is adding value, Georgia is contributing, Georgia is delivering on prosperity for its citizens. So, you mentioned the dams earlier. That's part of it. You have a cable, but you also want to have electricity to export. Azerbaijan wants to export through the cable, which I think is fantastic. It ties the region together, which is better for prosperity and for security. But we also want to make sure that Georgia is best poised to take advantage of any opportunities that would.
both understand that both Anaklia project and the Black Sea Cable project, these are quite large, geopolitically important projects as well. And the government hasn't been so far very good in explaining to its population why these projects matter so much for Georgia. But I also remember Ms. Degnan talking about the U.S. helping Georgia on some kind of investor screening mechanism. Could you please update us on that?
So that's another ongoing project that we are working with, and our Department of Commerce colleagues are here. It seems like every month, every other month, working on developing the capacity, because investment screening is important. You want to make sure that you attract not just investors, but high quality investors, the kind of investors that transfer knowledge and technology, the kind of investors that make you more prosperous, that make you more secure, and so some form of investment screening will make sure that that investment is controlled by Georgia and has maximum benefit for Georgia.
You mentioned earlier double-digit growth. What we see, and we all understand why these numbers are double digits, but what we see is that in surveys, polls, this growth still isn't inclusive.
I think that Georgia needs to be ready to take advantage of all of the opportunities that are being offered. The fact that there's big trade numbers with non-inclusive growth is not unique to Georgia in any way. This is a challenge that all the economies in the world are facing. And that's why when we work on developing the economy, we don't work on developing macroeconomic numbers or GDP growth. We really look at what's the impact to the Georgian people. Are we creating jobs? Are we helping the average Georgian have a better life? That's why USAID does so much work on high value agriculture so that Georgian farmers can get more money for what they grow. We also want to make sure that it's growing in a way that makes Georgia more secure, and that means less dependent on Russia. So when we work on our energy projects, we're looking at how can we help Georgia diversify its energy so that it's less dependent. One project that I've actually worked very hard on is a wheat project that we're doing to help Georgian growers grow more wheat. Because right now, almost all of the wheat and wheat flour is imported from Russia. And I think that Georgians have worked with Russia long enough to know that if you rely on Russia for anything, they will use that against you. And so our hope is that by bringing in U.S. technologies and U.S. know-how, that we can help Georgian farmers produce enough wheat so that Georgia is less dependent. And so that's what we are looking at, the outcomes, and what are the outcomes for the Georgian people. We know how important wine is to Georgia, both economically and culturally. And so we have programs where we are helping wine growers better be prepared to go into the U.S. market. And now in 2022, it was over 1 million bottles in the U.S. Of Georgian wines, and I hope that grows. I'm looking forward to a day when I go back to my home and I can go to any wine store and share my Georgian experience with my friends through wine.
Thank you for these words. You mentioned that the focus needs to be on people and how we're helping these people, and that's exactly the million-dollar question here when it comes to the government. Because recently, what we see, the government is definitely tilting into subsidies, price caps, and also like employment programs by government. Do you think this is the right way to go, considering that Georgia is still not a high-income country?
I think you need a mix of programs, and what that balance is very complicated. So you can't just sit and sort of judge like that subsidy is good, this subsidy is bad. You need to look at the big picture and make sure that you're delivering real sustainable growth for your people. So sometimes subsidies are important. Are they a long-term solution? They aren't really. But how do you create the space to support people? And then sometimes that is subsidies. Job programs can be very good to help build skills. And we do a lot of work in the vocational field to match skills and opportunities to make sure that Georgians are better prepared and better educated. We also want to work to make sure that the best and brightest Georgians are staying here in Georgia. You know, my experience in Georgia is that Georgians really like Georgia and they don't want to leave if they have the opportunities here. And so this goes to one of the reasons why we want to tie Georgia into the European economy and get Georgia into the EU. Because why go to the EU when you can be in the EU?
That's right. Looking at inflation as the main challenge for today, and we see that this was the first time when in the polls, Georgians said that inflation is number one issue for them. Inflation has surpassed poverty and employment or unemployment as the main national issues. Do you think NBG has done enough to keep inflation close to the target, because target is 3%?
This is a very big challenge. It's one that our country is also struggling with, how to deal with inflation as both COVID and now the war has disrupted international supply chains. So it's very hard to say how to deal with it, what's the best way forward. I think the important thing is, again, to just focus on how, for the long term, do we build things? In terms of the National Bank of Georgia, they are an unheralded asset for Georgia. I know that all of the decisions aren't always popular, but Georgia has greatly benefited from their steady hand on the wheel through COVID and through now the war, resisting the temptation to deliver some short-term gains that would hurt Georgia in the long term. One of the reasons why the ratings stayed stable and they were so positive was because the international financial institutions have such faith in the National Bank of Georgia keeping a firm hand on the wheel. So is inflation much higher than the target? Yes. Is that true in a lot of places in the world? Yes. But they've kept the reserves high. They've been very careful about making sure they can pay down debt when they have money. The lari is incredibly high against the dollar, even as the dollar is incredibly high against other currencies around the world. Obviously, that carries good and bad with it, like anything. But I would say that if you're going to start to look at why Georgia is actually in as solid a position as it is right now, you would have to put the National Bank of Georgia near the top of that.
On March the 2nd, NBG will have to have a new president, as you know. And you just mentioned the independence and the importance of independence of this institution, especially in light of 12 conditions that we have from the EU that deal mainly with checks and balances problem that Georgia unfortunately has at this point. And you already mentioned court system and judiciary system in Georgia and its challenges. What type of president should NBG have from your standpoint? And would it be wise to nominate someone who's like acting in government right now? Would that undermine this independence type of issue?
I mean, you're right to raise the new president of the National Bank, because the whole world, at least the whole business world and the economic community, is going to be looking very carefully at that. Because even though Georgians may not realize it, I can tell you that businesses and banks and the international financial institutions do realize what asset the National Bank of Georgia has been through some very, very difficult financial times. And so whoever is appointed, people will look, are they independent? Are they going to be able to stand up to political pressures, and pressures from the business community, who are also often looking for short-term gains to make sure that Georgia's economy remains solid for the long term. Obviously, are they a professional? Do they have skills? Georgia has a lot of very strong economists who are independent and very experienced on the world stage. So there's plenty for Georgia to choose from. But the important thing is to have somebody who is unquestionably qualified and doesn't even have the appearance of political influence, so that Georgia can keep the same level of confidence that it has from.
Currently, Russia has become #1 market for Georgia for oil imports. And the reason for that was several, but the main reason that business and the government says is that because it is cheap. But on the other hand, we understand that Russia has really big problems of selling its oil. And that's part of the policy that the EU and the world and the West is taking against Russia. Sometimes it's not really nice to think that Georgia is playing like a lifeguard part for Russia in that. Do you see any steps coming from the Georgian government, talking to businesses, talking to society, how we can diversify from Russia? Because that's the policy that EU countries are taking right now, right? So you can find some other ways and not to be dependent on Russia. Do you see that urge?
We are talking with the government all the time about diversifying. I think that these large hydropower plants are a big part of that, and I think that it would be better if the people of Georgia understood that when they see a big dam that can be controversial, that what that large dam means is more independence from Russia and more economic prosperity. That is our what we think about every day is how can we make Georgia more prosperous and more secure? How can we make the Georgian people more prosperous and more secure? And so diversifying away from energy dependence on Russia, which the entire world is working on now, is one way to do it. Georgia is blessed with natural resources across a wide area, including fantastic wine and grapes that we talked about before, and beautiful scenery, but also incredible renewable energy potential. And so Georgia can take advantage of the blessings that God has given it to become less dependent on Russia, and that's the direction that Georgia should move. And that's what we're trying to assist the Georgian people.
You mentioned Georgian wine, and very rightly so, because that was the one example where we actually saw that Georgia doesn't that much need a Russian market, because in 2006, when there was a Russian embargo, Georgian wine found new markets. It was Ukraine, it was EU, because of the steps. It was China, because of the steps of diversification. Why doesn't that example hold? I understand, of course, that this market, it's easy to reach. It needs less efforts for marketing, whatever. But it also is a political tool in the hands of Russia, and we've seen that.
Yeah, the Russian market is what I refer to as a sugar high. I don't know if you have that in Georgian, where you eat all the candy bars and you have a lot of energy for a very short period of time. But it's not sustainable, and it's the same. It's easy, it's quick, but it is not for the long term. And so that's what we focus on with the U.S. government and our partnership, is that we focus on the long-term development for the Georgians, so that Georgia is safer and more prosperous in the future.
Should Georgia be so open for Russian migrants, for example, because we see these debates of, having some visa rules for them. Also, we heard what Lavrov said about Georgia's government, that it is doing a good job in, standing up to the Western pressure. We hear that from time to time that Georgia might get direct flights from Russia. What would be your position on that? Is it time to integrate with Russia more in this international context where black and white is very visible?
Yeah, Russia is there, and there's no ignoring that. But Georgia does need to and has had success moving away from Russia and diversifying away from Russia. There are ties between Georgia and Russia. There will always be ties between Georgia and Russia. But the idea is that at a time when the world is moving away from Russia, Georgia has to make sure it's not tying itself closer to Russia. And I will say that something like direct flights would be very problematic. There would be no way to do that without violating international sanctions. But also, it sends a signal to which direction you're going. Georgia, since it became independent in the 90s, has always had up to two paths, a Western path and a Northern path. And it's up to the Georgians to choose what path, but I've heard them say pretty clearly they want the Western path. But it's not easy. A friend of mine used a really good metaphor that I liked, that being this close to Russia, and Russia's so big, Russia is like a big current that's pulling you towards Russia and pulling you towards Russia. And Georgia's a little boat. So if Georgia is not full on the gas away from the current, if it's just a little on the gas towards the west or not actively moving towards the west, it's not standing still. It is being pulled towards Russia. There's no such thing as neutrality for Georgia, as Georgia's history has shown time and again and again and again. And so we want to help Georgia keep that gas on the boat to keep moving away from Russia.
Do you see Georgia using these 12 conditions to have that gas?
Well, the 12 points that the EU raises, I think one thing to note is that these are not new things. These are things that the US, that the EU have been talking to Georgia for a long time. And Georgia has developed great relationships with organizations like OSCE and Venice Commission to help. And when we give these recommendations, what these recommendations are is learning from our experiences, our successes, our mistakes, and we want to share those experiences so that Georgia can learn from us, doesn't have to learn lessons the hard way. We've learned a lot of lessons the hard way. And so what we're saying is, these are the things that have made us more prosperous and more secure. And we believe that if you follow these recommendations, it'll make you more prosperous and more secure, and it will tie you closer to the international community, closer to the US, closer to Europe. I think one thing, when you're talking about Russia and the United States, when you're talking about the Northern path and the Western path, Russia wants its partners to be insecure, unstable. They want their partners to be poor so that they can manipulate them. They want their partners to be beholden to them. The United States, we want our partners strong. We want them safe. We want them secure so that we can work together. Russia wants its partners weak. The United States wants its partners strong.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
The Checkpoint is presented by GM Pharma, the first international multinational pharmaceutical company in Georgia. GM Pharma, to serve those who need it most.